So this narration is on crime, deviance, and social control. Pretty important topic in sociology. Questions are: what is deviance? How is morality defined and regulated? Who defines deviance? And of course, how is social control imposed on society? Well, deviance, of course, happens when a person violates the established group boundaries of any group. And at risk, of course, is group membership. By being in a group, you agree, at least implicitly, to follow the rules. Freud believed, of course, that all cultures impose rules on the young as a way of social control. And the first lessons about the futility of rebellion come from violating the rules. Sometimes group boundaries give affirmation in a positive way. There are an infinite variety of markings, behaviors, and attributes that signal who's in and who's out. You can also have symbolic boundaries, like having some identifying feature that makes you part of the group. Sometimes there's negative ones as well. They include that which people are not allowed to do if they're in group membership, like stealing or taking something from somebody else or causing violent acts. These can be something that's explicit, like a rule that's written down, or something that's you just know not to do. Sometimes there's laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye. Sometimes it's called retributive justice. Sometimes you can define what's deviant in terms of statistics, how often something happens, versus whether or not it violates social rules. So social norms reveal unstated, written, and non-articulated rules of everyday life. So if you're eating dinner at the dinner table and you burp, you violate a norm in most cases. They tell much about the nature and character of a society. Every society has different norms, including the rules of engagement, how you interact with people, making eye contact in some and not making eye contact in others, a type of engagement and a social norm. Rules about personal space, whether you're huggy or you're standoffish. How is morality defined and regulated? Well, moral behavior is defined as the types of behavior considered good and right, not whether it's a violation of some code of conduct, but whether or not it's a good or right behavior. Immoral behavior is something that's considered bad or wrong. So pornography is a good example. Moral code says that it might be something wrong or bad, but that's not the same thing as an ethical code. Sometimes there's interested punishment that's related to strong and direct interests in maintaining wealth and political domination. And sometimes it's disinterested punishment related to control of morals and social behavior. So regulating pornography might be a disinterested punishment if you're caught. An interested one might be to maintain same type of wealth or political dominance, like bookkeeping, if you violate bookkeeping. The temperance movement is a good example of disinterested in terms of prohibition. In the 1920s and 30s, prohibited the use of alcohol and established the upper middle class traditional values. Of course, that didn't go over well. Immigrants became public face of alcohol excesses because they came from places where alcohol was used liberally and wasn't prohibited. The most influential advocates were wives from upper class families. The Women's Christian Temperance Union provided instructional materials and legislative leadership on how to avoid the scourge of alcoholism, including Carrie Nation. There were similar campaigns against opium, morphine, and heroin. There was no U.S. regulation, however, until 1914. In the case of Webb versus the United States, Rural prescriptions must be individually prescribed. There's much ado about the legalization of marijuana, which in the state of Illinois is now legal. Contemporary moral codes. Our attempts to regulate morality remains very much part of American society. This might be seen in the same-sex marriage crusade, or at least against it. Includes the war on drugs, started by Richard Nixon in the 1970s and Ronald Reagan in 1985. Criminalization of drugs since 1980 became a way of policing poor neighborhoods and communities. The crusade against homosexuality, which includes the Stonewall Inn incident, where people were killed in 1969 in New York City, and Lawrence v. Texas in 2003 overturned the ruling of anti-gay laws. Who defines? Well, of course we all do. Sometimes it's through labeling theory, that is, you process by which behavior is defined as critical to understanding what causes it, and labels are often hard to shed. Many kinds of behaviors are deviant solely because they are labeled so. Becker 1963 talks about deviance as a social construction that evolves over time. So, for example, during the American Civil War, homosexuality was a felony, and now in the 1960s it was considered a mental illness, and now it's considered neither. Understanding deviance involves looking at why and how certain behaviors and people get labeled, and at behaviors of the labeled people. Sutherland, 1949, talked about white-collar crime, which largely goes undetected unless it's a huge social impact, unethical business practices committed by people in the course of their work lives, like embezzlement. It often creates damage equal to the kinds of crimes that poor people commit, but should it be treated the same way? There's some controversy about the treatment. So if you're a congressman or a governor who gets arrested for mail fraud, you spend your time in a minimum security prison in Wisconsin, whereas if you're a low-level criminal who's poor, you may spend your time in a highly dangerous prison in Joliet or Chicago or downstate. This includes examples like the Enron scandal, where it involved creating false profits, manipulating energy prices in California, and grossly defrauding stockholders, or for that matter, Bernie Madoff, who embezzled to the tune of about $11 billion. U.S. banking and financial crisis was also caused by white-collar criminal behavior that destabilized the banking industry and the housing industry, making subprime loans that resulted in massive mortgage defaults because insurances couldn't keep up with the cost of the defaults. State deviance, terrorism, and war crimes is another type of deviant behavior. So when the state, not necessarily like a state like Illinois, but the state as a government, engages in criminal behavior, policies and actions carried out by a government official in their official capacities, like a coup or overthrowing a government. It also includes terrorism, use of violence to achieve some political objective, and of course these often happen in the theater of war, like Abu Ghraib, and they undermine legitimate strategies. Even guerrilla warfare, where in some places like in Vietnam, where soldiers practiced more stealthy types of attacks than straight frontal attacks. The emergence of terrorism in the contemporary world is relatively new, but it progressed from the battlefield to strategic ploys of generals to avoid battlefield, to guerrilla warfare undercover, to terrorism. How is social control maintained? Well, through the institutions of social control, like sanctions, where punishments that a group or society establishes to enforce a norm. So if you're speeding, you get a speeding ticket, that's a sanction. To formal sanctions, used to inform norms that are written into law and that are usually carried out by groups of people given specific tasks and powers to do so. So the example I just used would be a formal sanction. Another sanction might be a less formal one, would be one that your mother gives you when you do something inappropriate at the dinner table. And informal sanctions conveyed in such as insults, dirty looks, insults, etc. The ambiguity in the line between deviance and conformities has created pressure to expand formal sanctions. Of course, the institutions of social control are the criminal justice system, including criminal law, police forces, lawyers, court systems, jails, prisons, and parole offices. It's a cottage industry and an institution, including jails, which typically keep people up to a year, and prisons that hold them longer. They hold accused people before trial, misdemeanor offenders, and those with maximum sentences of less than a year. Prisons, on the other hand, contain convicted felons serving sentences for more than 1 year. Often, by the way, jails are more dangerous places than prisons because you have the whole issue of mentally ill and substance abusing people detoxifying in jails. Offenders of criminal laws are punished to extract retribution instead of rehabilitation for victims of criminal acts, often to deter offenders and others from future crimes, and to incapacitate or prevent offenders from committing future crimes. Lastly, of course, to rehabilitate or reform offenders, but this is at the other end of the pendulum swinging. Mass incarcerations have grown dramatically over the years because moral crusades against certain kinds of individual behaviors like drug use, through politics, the right being tough on crime, conservative backlash to social and cultural movements in the 1960s, economic downturns of the 1970s, and urban riots of the 1960s. And of course, racism is overlaid in this whole thing, involves stereotype based on perceived characteristics rooted in mostly in skin color. It has influenced racial stereotyping about criminality throughout U.S. history. The rising prison population reflects a new type of Jim Crow, which were laws passed after the Civil War to restrict blacks from mostly white activities.